Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Chol HaMoed. We pick up today in Siman Taf Kuf Mem Hey on the bottom of Yud Zayin Amud Beis with Siv Zayin. Says the Mechaber, Kol Hadvarim Shemuter Lichtov. All of the things that we have learned so far in this Siman, where it is permissible to write on Chol HaMoed, Afilu beloy shinui mutter. You're allowed to do that writing even without a shinui. You don't have to change the method of writing in any way. You could write in the perfectly normal way. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Membeis, Kol Advarim, Hainu HaMevuarim le'el b'sifhei, Oishehu Davara Aved. What's the Mechaber referring to when he says the things that you are allowed to write? So the Mishnah Berurah tells me we're talking about the things that are mentioned in Sif Hey that we learned previously, all the different types of legal documents, etc., that you're allowed to write. And over there, if you remember, the Mishnah Berurah said that there are two reasons you're allowed to write these things. One is that these things are called Tzarchei Rabim and Tzarchei Moed, and therefore you're even allowed to write these things with a Maaseh Uman. And the Mishnah Berurah tells us over here, so that's the things that were written in Sif Hey. Or the Mishnah Berurah says, when the Mechaber says things that you're allowed to write, we're talking about when you're writing to prevent a loss, when you're writing, doing a malacha that's considered a davar ha'aved. And we learned that any time you do a malacha that's a davar ha'aved, you're allowed to do even a maaseh uman. So what the Mechaber is telling me over here, very succinctly, the Mechaber is telling me, any of these cases where we said you're allowed to write, because either it's a davar ha'aved or it's a tzarchei rabim and a tzarchei moed, in all of those cases you're allowed to do a maaseh uman, and therefore you could write in a perfectly normal way, even though we may consider that to be a maaseh uman. Continues the Mechaber, v'chol masha osur lichtov, and any time we say you're not allowed to write on Chol HaMoed, afilu al yedei shinui osur, then it's forbidden to write even if you make some kind of shinui and you write in an atypical way. Now this is a little bit complex. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Katan Mem Gimel, and I have to say that I'm still a little bit puzzled with this Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Mem Gimel, anytime it's usher to write on Chol HaMoed, the Mechaber says, Afilu al yedei shinui usher, you're not allowed to write even if you make a shinui. Pirush, which the Chavetz Chaim says, the Pirush, the explanation of this is, she'oisa shinui biyodai b'shas haksiva, where you make some kind of shinui with your hand at the time of writing, so that you hold the pen in a funny way. You're gonna write, but you're gonna hold the pen in a funny way. Kigoin, she'oiches hakolmus, you hold the pen bein gudol le'etzpa, between the thumb and the middle finger, or when you write the lines at an angle. But you're not making any kind of shinui in the final product, in the writing. So the outcome of the malacha is perfectly normal. The print that's going to be written on the paper is going to be perfectly normal. The letters and the words are going to be formed perfectly. The shinui that you're making is you're making a shinui in the performance of the malacha. You're holding the pen funny, you're writing on the paper in a funny angle, but the letters and the words are all perfectly normal. Zeh aser. That, the Chavetz Chaim says, that's what the Mechaber means. When the Mechaber says that if it's aser to write on Chol HaMoed, it's even aser with a shinoi, he means when the shinoi does not affect the outcome, the written outcome in any way. Avalim yesh shinoi baksav atzmai, but if there is a shinoi in the outcome, if the writing itself is going to be meshuna, kegoin, for example, she'oisa ha'oisiyos chatuchais ushvurais be'emtzeisan, you write the letters and you break the letters so that the letters are not whole letters. You make a break in the middle of the letter. V'hayud oisa oisa kain igul katan, or maybe when you make a yud, instead of making a tiny line, you just make a dot or a little round dot for your yud, zehu mutter. That's mutter, because now the outcome, the writing itself, is mishuna. Now, when I said that I'm a little puzzled by the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you what I mean. Precisely what is the Mishnah Berurah telling me the Mechaber means here? The Mechaber says if it's usher to write on Chol HaMoed, it's usher to do that writing even if it's a shinui. Well, what case are we talking about? If we're talking about a case where you have a tzarech HaMoed, you have a tzarech HaMoed to write on Chol HaMoed. Okay, if you have a tzarech on Chol HaMoed and it's a tzarech HaMoed, you're allowed to do malacha if it's a Maaseh Hedyot. So if you're writing in a way that's a Maaseh Hedyot, that's mutter. You want to write a Maaseh Uman, that's aser. Now, could be that what the Mishnah Berurah is telling me the Mechaber means is, in a case where writing that's a Maaseh Uman is aser, so then it's even aser if you hold the pen funny. Because since the outcome, since the written letters and the written words are going to be formed perfectly, it's still a Maaseh Uman. So therefore, if the Maaseh Uman was aser, the Maaseh Uman is still aser. If we're talking about a case where you have a heter to write, because you have a tzarech, and you're going to write, but you have to write in a Maaseh Hedyot, so then is what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is that this doesn't make it this doesn't make it a Maaseh Hedyot. This type of shinoi doesn't make it a Maaseh Hedyot. And in a case where it's also to write even a Maaseh Hedyot, in other words, let's say you don't have a tzarech HaMoed. You have no tzarech at all. Just you want to write. And it's not a tzarech HaMoed. It's not something that has to be done today. It could be done after Yom Tov. But you want to do it now. So in that case, it's also to write even a Maaseh Hedyot. So then too, I think the Mishnah Berurah is saying, writing with a shinui is not going to render that writing permissible. Now, why would you think it does render that writing permissible? Because you want to tell me that a shinui turns something from a Maaseh Uman to a Maaseh Hedyot, I can hear an argument. But why would you think that writing with a shinui renders something not even a Maaseh Hedyot? Maybe what he means is that we know when it comes to Isurei D'Rabbanan, very often, let's say on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, Isurei D'Rabbanan, when you do a malacha with a shinui, it's not considered a malacha. But over here on Chol HaMoed, why is malacha aser? One of the primary reasons malacha is aser on Chol HaMoed is because of tercha. Holding the pen in a different way doesn't make it any less of a tercha. So even if you want to tell me it makes it less of a malacha because you're doing it al yedei shinoi, it doesn't make it less of a tercha, so it's still aser. So again, to say this in a concise way, I guess what I'm saying is like this: the Mechaber says that if it's aser to write on Chol HaMoed, then writing with this kind of shinoi isn't going to help. And I'm breaking this down into a couple of different categories. If the reason the writing is aser is because you're doing a Maaseh Uman, you have a tzarech HaMoed, but you're not allowed to do a Maaseh Uman, you're only allowed to do a Maaseh Hedyot, then you should know holding the pen funny doesn't take what was a Maaseh Uman and make it a Maaseh Hedyot. If the outcome, if the written letters and the written words are going to be the same, then it's still considered a Maaseh Uman. If the writing that you're doing is aser even to do a Maaseh Hedyot because you don't have a tzarech HaMoed, then writing it with a shinoi doesn't help because you're still not allowed to write. It's still a terchi, you're still not allowed to write. Okay. Continues the Mishnah Berurah here on the bottom line, and it's cut mem gimel. V'zeu le'inyan ksiva maruba. This is when we're talking about like what we call ashuris. Aval inyan ksav meshita, or ksav shalanu, when it comes to our easy scripts form of writing. Ayin la'el b'sivkat lamed hey. Then he sends you back to sivkat lamed hey, where I seem to remember in Oiskat Lamed Hey on Yud Zayin Amud Beis, near the top of the Mishnah Berurah, he said that if you're writing Ksav Meshita, that's not a Maaseh Uman, but we make a little bit of a shinoi when we write Ksav Meshita that you should write a line on top on a diagonal. So then even the Ksav Meshita, which we already considered to be a Maaseh Hedyot, not a Maaseh Uman, still we do it with Epis Shinoi and we write on an angle. Okay. Now we go back to the Shulchan Aruch. Let's go to the Ramah. Hago. Ubeluchay shel shava. If you have a tablet that's coated with wax, and you write by engraving something into the wax, Mutter lichtov, you're allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed lefi she'ein ksav hamiskayim, because this is not considered a ksiva. The letters that you form in the wax do not last, and therefore it's not considered a ksiva. Says the Mishnah Berurah on Yud Ches Amud Aleph is cut mem daled shel shava, tablets of wax. The efshir duhu did beluchais shalanu. The same halacha may apply to our luchais, and I don't know what he's referring to here with luchais shalanu. I don't know what kind of tablets he's talking about. Kasav a prima gadim, and the prima gadim writes masha kaisvin bekanei oiferes al haluchais muupatzos. They had some way of writing with a lead pencil on something coated with lime. V'chadoyme efshir deshari. It's possible that that's mutter ayin sham oid. Now we go to Siv Ches. I need Ches Amud Aleph. Misha sholchu lishal mimenu she'ela. If you're a rav and somebody sent you a shaila, and you're going to send back a written tshuva. We're talking about days of yesteryear, the times of the Chavetz Chaim, let's say, where when you had a shaila to send to a gadol, you wrote a letter. So you wrote the shaila, you gave it to somebody, he brought it to the rav, and now the rav has to write a tshuva and send it back to you. And the shliach who brought you the shaila doesn't want to hang around town until after Yom Tov to take the tshuva back. Mutter lekasva. Then you're allowed to write the tshuva on Chol HaMoed, because it's a davar avid. If I don't write the tshuva now and send it back with the shliach, how is the tshuva going to get back to the shayl? The shayl is not going to be able to get a tshuva. So you're allowed to write the tshuva on Chol HaMoed. V'chein, and similarly, says the Mechaber, mutter laha'atika. You're allowed to write over a second copy of the tshuva so that you could keep one in your files. Mipnei shechashav davar avid. Because if you don't write over the tshuva now, you might not be able to write it over later. It's all considered a davar avid. Says the Mishnah Berurah, and it's cut mem hey mutter lekasva. You're allowed to write the tshuva. Afilu im hi shaloi l'tzarech hamayid. Even if the tshuva is not a tzarech hamayid. It's not a shaila that has to do with sukkah or lulav and esrig. It's a shaila that has to do with Chanukah licht. So it's not a tzarech hamayid to write it on Chol HaMoed, but you're allowed to do it anyway because it's a davar avid, and for a davar avid, even a ma'aser woman is mutter. Why is it a davar avid? Pen la yimtzach hakach yidei mila shalcha. Because we're not talking about when there's a post office. Right now, you have a shliach to send the tshuva back to the shayl with. If you don't send the tshuva back to the shayl now, you don't know if you're going to have a way to send the tshuva to the shayl. So it's a davar avid. Is cut memvav. The Mechaber said you're allowed to write over a second copy. Mutter la'atika sheyishar etzlai ha'ataka, so that you should retain a copy of the tshuva kedei shelo yishkachena, so that it should not be forgotten. Now we go to Sif Tes, says the Mechaber. Ve'im shama dvar chidush. Let's say you heard a beautiful shir on Chol HaMoed, and you heard a chiddush. You want to write it down. Mutter lekasvai kedei shelo yishkach. You're allowed to write down that chiddush that you heard, so that it should not be forgotten. Now there's a beautiful Mishnah Berurah over here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, there's Katan Mem Zayin. V'im shama dvar chidush. So first of all, the implication of the Mechaber over here was, if you happen to hear a chiddush, you could write it down. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'hu adin demuter l'shmaya lechatchila kedei lekasvai. You're allowed to go to the shir lechatchila and plan on writing it down. Gam ein chiluk beinim shama hachidush mei acher oy chidshei hu atzmai. Also, this heter doesn't only apply if you happen to hear a chiddush from somebody. Let's say you're learning the parsha and you come up with a chiddush, or you're learning the daf and you come up with a chiddush. You're allowed to write down the chiddush that you came up with. Because many times you come up with a chiddush, and if you don't write it down right away, you forget it. And later that chiddush is going to be lost. And that means that a contribution that you made to the body of the Torah Kedosha is going to be lost forever. That's a zichar, davar avid. So if you hear a chiddush or you come up with a chiddush, you're allowed to write it down. Va'afilu b'loy tam shikha. Now the Chavetz Chaim says a wondrous thing. He says even without this reason, that it's a davar avid because you might forget the chiddush, there's another reason why you're allowed to write it down on Chol HaMoed. Kevan shebechol eis varega. Since you have a chiyuv of every minute of your day, you have a chiyuv to have amelus b'Torah, to work in Torah, and part of that chiyuv is that you have to work to be mechadesh as much as you can. It's not only a chiyuv to simply learn, it's a chiyuv to work on the Torah. and to come up with novel ideas and to come up with chidushim. That's part of your chiyuv. Ein shaykh loimer yamten aracha yomtiv v'az yichtav achidush. Now you can't say that the person should not write down the chiddush on Chol HaMoed, and instead he should wait until after Yom Tov to write the chiddush. You know why? The oisay zman yelov chiyuv acher. Because after Yom Tov, when you have time to learn, you have a chiyuv then to come up with new chiddushim. The hainu sheichadish achakach chidushim acherim. After Yom Tov, I got to come up with new chidushim. If you're telling me that now after Yom Tov I have to write down the chidushim that I came up with on Chol HaMoed, yitztarach lo moed shenis masha lamed kvar ulahasker masha chidish mikvar. So now you're telling me I have to learn over again what I learned on Chol HaMoed, and I have to be busy with the chidushim that I came up on Chol HaMoed and write those. But now I have a new chiyuv. I want to go weiter. You can't tell me I have to do that. You're being mevatel me from coming up with new chidushim after Yom Tov. Ve'ein lecha davar aved gadol mizeh. Chavetz Chaim says, what's a bigger davar aved than that? I'm taking away time from your Torah learning to go weiter in your Torah learning. Ve'eidu ala Bach zal. Chavetz Chaim says that they said testimony on the Bach shekosav chiburav b'Chol HaMoed, that he wrote the Bach on Chol HaMoed. Still in all, he says that you should write it with script, with ksav meshita. If you have to write in Ashuras, yichtav ois shavar, you should write it in a broken fashion. The Chanal. Ois katan mem ches. We said mutal kasvai. You're allowed to write down your chidushim. But v'cheshben atekufais, if you're working on zmanim and you want to make a cheshben of the zmanim, also lichtav, that you're not allowed to write. That's not something that you're going to forget. Sefer atzarich lebamayid limud. Let's say you need a sefer. You need a sefer to learn from on Chol HaMoed. You can't just go out to Eichler's and buy it in those days. Mutal l'sakein v'lichreich ba'atzma. You're allowed to prepare it and bind it by yourself on Chol HaMoed. V'cholshkein al yidei akum. Certainly you can have a non-Jew do it. They have a davar of it. Because if you don't have the sefer, that's considered a davar of it. You're not going to be able to learn. Aval also l'sakein kuntris kedei lichtav l'achar HaMoed. But you cannot go ahead and bind a notebook so that you should have a notebook to write in after Yom Tov. Kasra achreidim, the achreidim write kol masha muta lichtav, anything that you're allowed to write on Chol HaMoed. Muta lasis kolmas udiyay atzarach lazeh. You're allowed to prepare the quill and you're allowed to make ink. Or l'sartet l'tzarach dvar hamutarim, and you're allowed to make sirtut. You're allowed to make the impressed lines on the paper. Nistapik bel yarao l'sartet l'tzarach dvar hamutarim. To make sirtut on a paper, nistapik bel yarab, the el yarab is mesupik, whether or not you're allowed to do that on Yom Tov. The Sefer Lekat HaKemach says you're not allowed to do this, because sirtut only makes the writing nicer, so it's not really necessary. Only if you're writing tefillin or mezuzah, so then sirtut is part of the halachic requirements, and they're not valid without the sirtut, then it's mutter. You'll excuse me for 1 second, I just have to change the batteries on my recorder. Hold on, please. Sorry about that little pause there for a second. Let me just let my recorder start up again. This is the audio recording that goes on to Nucky Radio, and Baruch Hashem, I noticed that the battery was about to die. So I'm just letting the recorder boot up here, and then we will go weiter. We will pick up with Sif Yud in the Mechaber. Okay. The recorder is waking up. I'm sorry. Bear with me, please. Okay. There we go. Okay, so now we go weiter. Back in the Shulchan Aruch, let's go to Sif Yud. Donin bein dine mamonis bein dine nefashos. You're allowed to adjudicate monetary cases, and in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, even capital cases on Chol HaMoed. V'hayu mishamtin umakin, and they would put into cherem, and they would dole out makas mardus, or I guess malchus. Lemisha lo kibel alav hadin. Well, if we're talking about somebody who wasn't mekabel the din, that's makas mardus. Somebody doesn't want to accept the psak of bezdin, they would meet out makas mardus on Chol HaMoed. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut mem tes bein din emamonis ritzaynai loymar. What the mechaber wants to say over here is the moed loy heavy kimay Shabbos for Yom Tov. Chol HaMoed is not considered like Shabbos and Yom Tov. The asur ladun bam. You're not allowed to judge. You're not allowed to adjudicate cases on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Afilu nisratzu shnehem. Even if the litigants are willing, you're not allowed to adjudicate cases on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Ubazeh shari im nisratzu abalidin ladun bam. But when it comes to Chol HaMoed, if the litigants are agreeable, you can hold a court case on Chol HaMoed. The ilu lichvais, because don't think that the mechaber means that you could force the litigants to have the case adjudicated on Chol HaMoed. That's not so. Because because you cannot force a litigant to come to a din Torah during the months of Nisan or Tishrei, because it's understandable that people are busy with the preparations for Yom Tovim. Kedisa b'chayshim mishpat siman hey ayin sham. Is cut nun din in nefashos, capital cases. HaMechaber hetik lashon habraisa. The mechaber is quoting over here the language of the brisa. The brisa in the Gemara by Yudkatan and Yudalad Amud Beis mentions dinei nefashos. We're talking about a time during the Beis Hamikdash when we were able to adjudicate capital cases. When Bezdin had a chiyuv of ubiyarta harami kirbecha, that if you had a murderer or somebody else who was chayiv misa, you had to go ahead and you had to adjudicate cases of capital punishment. The Chavetz Chaim is explaining to you, why does the mechaber say you could be done capital cases? We don't adjudicate capital cases. The answer is because he's quoting the brisa. The brisa was talking about the Zman Habayis. Now we go to the final sif in this very interesting and complex siman that dealt with the halachas of writing on Chol HaMoed. Mutter likbail b'shvil chayvaisav b'Chol HaMoed. You're allowed to register a complaint with Besdin if it comes to a monetary case. If you have to collect a debt and you're having trouble collecting the debt from the other party, you can enter a complaint with the authorities. Says the Mishnah Berurah, he's cutting on aleph likbail hainu bebeis hakneses. What he means over here is you can go to the shul and you could announce this complaint. Vayin la'el siman tavkov lamates sif gimel bahago. Okay, now we're going to start siman tavkov memvav. Anyway, before I start siman tavkov memvav, I just, after learning this whole siman tavkov memhei, we have to remember Mirz Hashem, when we come to Chol HaMoed, everybody should arrive at Chol HaMoed Pesach, Be'ezus Hashem Yisparach, in good health. Remember, when it comes to Chol HaMoed, when you want to take that pen out of your pocket to write something, remember the calculation that has to go through your mind. You're taking out a pen, you're about to do a malacha gemura. Writing is one of the lamites malachas. It's not mutter on Chol HaMoed. It's only mutter on Chol HaMoed if you have a tzarech hamoed. If the writing that you're going to do is a tzarech hamoed, so then you're allowed to do writing that's a ma'aseh hedyot. There are other cases. If it's a davar avud, you're allowed to write. If it's tzarchei rabim, you're allowed to write. But it has to be a tzarech hamoed. If it's tzarchei rabim and it's not a tzarech hamoed, you could write a ma'aseh hedyot. A ma'aseh hedyot. So, like the Mishnah Berurah said, a nice cut lamed hay. Our ksav, our script writing, our ksav meshita is seemingly considered to be a ma'aseh hedyot, and yet it's preferable to make some kind of shinui. So we have to think. It's not Chol HaMoed, you could write whatever you want. Remember that we're doing a malacha. Says You know what? Let me see. How long are we at? 24 minutes. All right. You know what? For the sake of continuity, I'm not going to start Siman Tov Kuf Mem Vav now, because if I do, we're only going to do a little bit of it, and then we're going to have to pick it up again after Shabbos. So we're going to stop over here, and Mirza Hashem, on Sunday, we will pick up with Siman Tov Kuf Mem Vav. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schos of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshuas, Refuas, and Parnasa to all those in need. And the Rebbeinu Shalom should be Mazakas. We should be able to greet Mashiach. We should see the Bias Gal Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. We talk Simcha. The Rebbeinu Shalom should stop all the tzaras. The Rebbeinu Shalom shouldn't let anybody see any more tzar. And like I said in the shir last night, we should be very careful to be makpid, not to cause tsar to another yid in any way, shape, or form, even if we think that we're within our rights. Don't be the cause of tsar to another yid. And based on that, we could come to the Rebbeinu Shalom and we could ask the Rebbeinu Shalom that he should not cause tsar to any yidin. If we are not makpid on ourselves, if we allow ourselves to be a source of tsar to another yid, even if we think that we're quote-unquote right, but still, we are the cause of another yid suffering, then how could we come to the Rebbeinu Shalom and ask the Rebbeinu Shalom that he should not be the cause of another yid's suffering? The Rebbeinu Shalom looks at us, the Rebbeinu Shalom says, are you so makpid? You're only makpid when I'm the source of tsar. When you're the source of tsar, you're not makpid. We have to make sure that we're makpid. We should be very, very careful not to be the source of another yid's tsar in any way, shape, or form. Everyone should have a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. Mirza Hashem. See you next week. Be well.